Good morning to each and every one of you. We have numerous visitors in the audience. We also have numerous of our people. I don't know what the term is for that. We have a lot of our number that is out, as was mentioned during the announcements. We have a lot of our number that is traveling. We also have a lot of other people's numbers that are here with us. And so whether you're here normally or whether you're a visitor, we're thankful that you've chosen to take time to be with us this morning. Hopefully encouragement. Hopefully it's been an exhorting moment or morning for all of us. I've certainly been encouraged by gathering together with the saints of God and by worshiping Him and by singing His praises, by praying together, by partaking of the Lord's Supper, and also by chit-chatting, by talking in the back, and by encouraging each other up through those means as well. So it's always a good time to be with other people of my precious faith, and I want you to know how much I appreciate your presence here this morning. A few weeks ago, Melina and I introduced Logan and Hannah. Hannah was a little less interested, but we introduced Logan and Hannah to one of my all-time favorite movies, which is The Santa Claus. As I watched this movie, it's probably been 15, 20 years since I've seen this movie, but I love Tim Allen in it. I love the whole storyline. I love the plot. I love everything about it. And I'm not going to spoil anything if you haven't seen it. It came out in 1997, but if you haven't seen it, I'm not going to spoil anything for you. But what you have in this movie, kind of the whole theme of it, as you're watching it as a kid, is this overarching feeling of the magic and of the presence of this moment, this time period that they exist in. As you watch it as a 31-year-old, you look back on it, you think to yourself, it's really much deeper than that. I'm not trying to get all meta about Toy Story and a Tim Allen movie, but when you look at Toy Story, when you look at Santa Claus, you can tell the movie mostly plays in our house. When you look at Santa Claus from a 31-year-old perspective, you start to see themes, and you start to see different impressions and things that they're trying to put across. And the main one to me, at least as I look at it, is this idea of a loss of innocence. And Tim Allen, if you watch the movie from start to finish, is just obsessed with this physical thing. Only things that he can see, only things he can touch, the here, the now, the present, those types of things. But over the course of the movie, he becomes entranced with magic. And he becomes entranced with believing in things that he may not have otherwise seen. And so you have this restoration of the loss of innocence. And I know I'm getting really in-depth on a movie about Tim Allen as he's dressed up in a leotard or a unitard right there. But it's a really in-depth movie, and so looking at it from a 31-year-old perspective is a little bit different than viewing it as a 9 and 10-year-old. And I couldn't help but think, as I watched that movie, that of this verse that kept popping up in my mind over and over again. As Jesus is talking to His apostles, as He's talking to the people around Him, He says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless you are converted and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." And this verse has spawned a lot of kind of weird theories by people wondering, what does Jesus mean? What is He talking about when He says that you have to become like children? What is He exactly alluding to? To me, it's pretty straightforward. As He's amongst the children, as they're there, you have the people that day that are pushing them aside and saying, they're not really the most important people. We need to get them out of the way so that we can spend time with just the Messiah. And what Jesus does in this verse is He says, unless you're like these people, you'll not enter the kingdom of heaven. And that second phrase is very important to me because the second phrase qualifies the first. We may not know what it means to be a child or it means to be like one of those little children, but we do know what it means to not enter the kingdom of heaven. And so what we need to figure out as we look at this verse is, what is Jesus driving at when He says, you have to be like the little children, you have to be like a child, or else you're not going to enter the kingdom of heaven. The context in Matthew chapter 18 actually bodes this out pretty well, because when you look at Matthew chapter 17, the first 3 verses, you have this magnificent show called the Transfiguration. That's at least the way that we've described it. And as you can imagine in your mind's eye, it's impossible for us to see exactly what's going on at this moment. But in Matthew chapter 17, you have Peter, James, and John that are sitting there, that they're asleep, and then Jesus is transfigured before them. And Matthew goes into quite a bit of detail. Luke goes into a little bit more detail about what's happening, but the appearance is just completely transformative. And not only do you have Jesus standing there, but you also have Moses and you have Elijah, all 3 of those people that are staying there, and Peter, James, and John are just in awe of it. And I like to think that when you look at the reason they are in awe is because you have this carpenter's son from Nazareth named Jesus, who is remarkable in his own right, and has done countless miracles, and has walked on water, has preached grand sermons and done so many amazing things, but to see him transformed and become deity, that's a completely different ballgame. And so you have Peter, James, and John's eyes that are being opened, and that's a moment that would stay with Peter, at least for the rest of his life, because you see him referencing that in 1 and 2 Peter as talking about that moment that he heard the prophetic word exclaimed. As you look a little further in Matthew chapter 17, you have this discussion with the apostles and with Jesus, and they're asking Jesus, in lieu of all the demons that are being cast out, Lord, all these other people are casting out demons, but we can't cast out this one. I don't know why we can't cast out this one. And Jesus says to him, if you have faith like a mustard seed, you could say to this mountain, pick up and go the other direction. You could cast out if you had that faith. And so what Jesus is imploring the apostles and the disciples to do in Matthew chapter 17 is restore this kind of pure faith towards God, this unwavering faith in who He is. That's the faith that God desires. Matthew chapter 18, you have this childlike faith in the first 6 verses, where it says, at that time the disciples came to Jesus and said, who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Notice how often some of the disciples are obsessed with who is the greatest. Not who's the least, but who's the greatest. And he called, verse 2, a child to himself and set him before them. And he said to them, truly, truly, this is our verse this morning, unless you are converted and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever then humbles himself as this child, he is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever receives such a child in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones to believe in me to stumble, it would be better for him to have a heavy millstone hung around his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea. This emphasis on the children is something that would not only stay here in Matthew chapter 18, the first 6 verses, would carry over into the next chapter. Because after you have this grand exposition of marriage, divorce, remarriage, of which very learned minds have still struggled with to this day and age, for whatever reason, because to me it's pretty straightforward. But this whole concession with this idea of, can I divorce? Can I put this person away? And the rest of Matthew chapter 18 has to do with these personal relationships. He then jumps into Matthew chapter 19 and talks about humility. And talks about patience, talks about faith, talks about the simplicity of life. And his overarching message is found there in Matthew chapter 18. Unless you become like children, you will no means enter the kingdom of heaven. So we're left here now looking at this verse and thinking to ourselves, what exactly is Jesus talking about when he talks about faith as a little child? And moreover, how can we develop that faith? I would argue to you first and foremost that it starts with a strong sense of innocence. One of the main reasons that I dislike Calvinism, there's about 347,000 reasons that I hate Calvinism, but one of the main reasons that I hate Calvinism is it takes away the purity of the heart. Those of you who have had children, those of you who have been around during the birth of a child know first and foremost that when that child enters the world, there is not an ounce of guilt within that child. There's not an ounce of depravity. There's not an ounce of immorality. As much as I hate it when Hannah cries in the middle of the night from the hours of 2 to 7 a.m. every single night, literally every single day, Monday through Saturday, including Sundays for the last 8 months, as much as I hate that, I know that that's not because Hannah is evil. I know that that's not because Hannah has some inbred hatred for me, some inbred immorality that just wants to span throughout the rest of time. That's not what you see in a child. And so when you look at a child, you have this strong sense of innocence that starts all the way back at the beginning. If you look at Genesis chapter 3, we look on this from retroactive eyes by looking back at the Garden of Eden. But when you think about, for instance, what life was like in Genesis chapter 3, you see chapter 1, and you see the creation narrative, and you see chapter 2, it kind of expounded upon. And then you see chapter 3 as Moses builds more on this idea of the innocence. Genesis chapter 3, you see this destruction of innocence, more or less. And you can almost imagine the life that Adam and Eve are living within this Garden of Eden as being very pure, as being very innocent. These people have no knowledge of Egypt. They have no knowledge of Babylon. They have no knowledge of Rome. They have no knowledge of sin. They don't even know what the difference is between right and wrong. And Adam and Eve are living in this idyllic world. And so after Genesis chapter 3, with this eating of the fruit, after the condemnation that happens immediately after that, Genesis chapter 3, the things that God would say back to these people, describes this loss of innocence. Genesis chapter 3, starting in verse 16, he says, to the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth, and in pain you shall bring forth children, yet your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. I would wager to guess that up until this point, Eve probably didn't really have a cognition of what pain was. She may have known it on very simple terms, but she wouldn't have known the pain, at least of what he's talking about here in this instance. When you look at verse 17, as now he's talking to Adam, he says to Adam, he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and you have eaten from the tree about which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat from it, cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you will eat of it all the days of your life, both thorns and thistles it shall grow for you, and you will eat the plants of the food, or the field, by the sweat of your face you will eat bread till you return to the ground, because from it you were taken, because you were dust, and to dust you shall return. Think about the contrast that you see in Genesis chapter 3 between the life that these people used to live and the life that they're living now. It's almost impossible for us to appreciate the life that Adam and Eve had within the Garden of Eden, where literally every single thing is available to them at the drop of a hat. And you have the intimacy with God. You have the walking together, at least in my own imagination. You have this intimacy with God where they're talking together, where they're walking together, where the fruit is readily available, and it's this completely idyllic setting. And all of that is gone. Because Eve listened to the voice of the serpent, and then Adam listened to the voice of both of them. And so you have this intermingling that contaminates the innocence that is there, and all of a sudden you have this introduction of pain, introduction of work, introduction of sweat, all these different things that happen at this moment. If you fast forward to Genesis 6 chapter, you can see right before the great flood that the sons of men, or the sons of God, become entranced with the daughters of men. And begin to look at the world around them and think to themselves, maybe life with God really isn't what it's all about. Maybe I need to look towards these other things. And that's where I need to focus my attention. That's where I need to grab towards. Exodus chapter 34, you have this building even further. Exodus chapter 34. Where the Israelites are leaving Egypt, completely oblivious to the world around them. I would wager a guess that in Exodus chapter 34, the Israelites, as we know them in this passage, are not aware of Babylon. Not aware of the world as we know. Today you can look on Google Maps and you can see literally every different part of the known world. You can expand a telescope and you can see into the farthest reaches of the universe. You can spin a globe and you can put your finger, I don't want to bring up Sweden for the second time today, but you can put your finger on Sweden and you can look at that. That's not the life that the Israelites are living. Their life is completely conceptualized with an understanding of Egypt and stories about Abraham. And God is cognizant of this. In Exodus chapter 34, starting in verse 11, He tells them to do something very specific. Exodus chapter 34, starting in verse 11, He says, "Be sure to observe what I am commanding you this day. Behold, I am going to drive out the Amorite before you, the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, the Jebusite, all those ites. Watch yourself that you make no covenant with the inhabitants of the land into which you are going, or it will become a snare in your midst." That's an important verse. Because what Moses is describing there in Exodus chapter 34, verse 12 is, don't form any kind of alliance with people that are not my people. Why? Because the end of verse 12, or the end of verse 12, because it will become a snare in your midst. It's going to cause you to stumble. Verse 13, "Rather you are to tear down their altars, smash their sacred pillars, cut down their Asherim, for you shall not worship any other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Otherwise you might make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land. And they would play the harlot with their gods and sacrifice to their gods, and someone might invite you to eat of his sacrifice, and you might take some of his daughters for your sons, and his daughters might play the harlot with their gods, and cause your sons also to play the harlot with their gods. You shall make for yourself no molten gods." When you look at Exodus chapter 34, you see what God has to say to these people. He comes across almost like an overbearing father, and I say that very tongue-in-cheek. But when you see what God is telling to these people, when you see what He's telling the Israelites, He's saying, I don't want you to hang out with those people. I don't want you to worship with them. I don't want you to marry with them. I don't want you to form an alliance with them. I want you to have nothing to do with them. Now the Israelites would look back at that and they would say, well, why is this? Why the reason for all these restrictions? And the reason is very clear. Because God does not want His people contaminated with the things of the world. Now I know nobody in this world lives in a bubble, and I know and you know that in order to exist in this world, we are going to have to live in the world around us. Paul would write in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 5, he would say in order to avoid the people of this world, you would literally have to live on Jupiter. You would have to go out of this world. So there's always going to be people around us that are not good for us. The key is to not intermingle with them, to not draw their influence for yourself, and to lose your innocence. It's startling, surprising. It's startling when you look at the world around us. And our world has been interconnected for so long. Our world has been interconnected for as long as we can think of. You can send a message across the entire globe, literally in seconds. And you can read about other cultures, you can read about other religions, but to see how much the culture of this world infiltrates the hearts of Christians is surprising. Here's some stats that will surprise you. The average child, we're talking about children, the average age a child says a swear word for the first time in their life is 4 years old. Not 14, 4. The average age a child views pornography for the first time is 8 years old, and the average age a child smokes marijuana for the first time is 16 years old. Now, what I'm not saying by throwing these stats out, I'm not just saying these mindful stats for my own benefit. The reason I'm throwing these stats out is not to say that if your child is 17, there's a great chance that they've viewed pornography, that they've smoked weed, that they've said a cuss word. That's not the point of saying that. The reason I'm saying that is because of the exposure that our kids have at such a young age. When you're looking at TV, when you're looking at the radio, when you're looking at newspapers, if you're looking at a mimeograph, whatever the situation is, our world is so much more interconnected than it used to be. And it's destroying our innocence little by intermingling with the world around us. And so when God says, when Jesus says that you have to have a childlike faith, that you have to develop this childlike faith, you have to have a sense of innocence about the world. An innocence about God, and purity of heart that only His people will have, that looks at the world around them and does not let that become a part of their life. That does not allow themselves to be contaminated by the world around them. That does not allow themselves to be cynical. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul will expound on this Old Testament principle in a New Testament way. 2 Corinthians chapter 6. Paul understands better than most of us the fact that the world is going to infiltrate people, it's going to infiltrate the church. At times, it needs to be removed. But he has some solid advice for all of us in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. And this is more than just advice. I would argue that it's commandments. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, starting verse 14, he says, "Do not be bound together with unbelievers. For what partnership has righteousness and lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? Or what harmony has Christ with Belial? Or what has a believer in common with an unbeliever? Or what agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God. Just as God has said, I will dwell in them and walk among them. I will be their God, they shall be my people. Therefore," verse 17, "come out from their midst and be separate, says the Lord. Do not touch what is unclean, and I will welcome you. I will be a father to you. You shall be sons and daughters to me, says the Lord God Almighty." All of us exist in a world that is growing more and more decayed and decrepit by the moment. Immorality seems like it's always increasing. Sinfulness seems like it's always abounding. I don't know if that's just because we're becoming more aware of it. But it seems like there is no end to the amount of evil that's in this world. And where Christians stand out is rising above that. By keeping themselves from those things. By not watching the same movies, the same television shows that those people watch. By not listening to the same music that those people listen to. By not keeping company with people that can eat away at your soul. And Satan is much smarter than we sometimes give him credit for. Because Satan is not going to be this guy that shows up, or this being that shows up and introduces sin into your life, and all of a sudden you're 300 miles away. That's not the way he does it. He does it little by little by little by little by little. Bringing people into your life. And by bringing things into your life that pull you slowly but steadily away from you. And so when he talks about developing this childlike faith, we need to have a sense of innocence about ourselves, a sense of purity, that we remain holy and separated from this world in thought, in deed, in word, everything that matters in this life. In your thinking, be mature, but in sin, be infants, as Paul was saying in 2 Corinthians. It's also a faith, I would argue, that's based on trust. One of my favorite things about Logan, and depending on whether or not he's healing, it can kind of change from day to day, but one of my favorite things about Logan is that no matter where we go, whether we're walking through not in the street, along the sidewalk of the streets, walking through a store, walking through the house, walking through the car, whatever the situation is that I can look at Logan and I can say, "You want to hold Daddy's hand?" I'm going to really try hard not to get emotional, so I'm just going to stare really hard at Jason so that I don't get emotional. But I look out and I say, "Can you hold Daddy's hand?" He thought I was kidding. "Can you hold Daddy's hand?" And he reaches out with that little tiny hand of his and he holds mine. And we walk together. And the most amazing thing about that entire prospect, of that entire incident, is that Logan has no idea where he's going. When I say, "Let's get in the car," he doesn't know if we're going on a 6-mile road trip to see Mimi in the Pocket. He doesn't know if we're going to Taco Bell, which is Daddy's favorite place. He doesn't know where we're going. But he takes my hand and he trusts that I'm going to lead him in the way that we should go. Psalm 23 is all about this. As we mentioned this morning when we were talking about our Bible class, Psalm 23 is all about this idea. That we trust God to lead us in the way that we should go. Not through some metaphysical or some meta-spiritual kind of idea where we sit and we hum and all of a sudden we have a strong inclination to go right. But that we honestly believe to our very core that God's Word gives us everything pertaining to life and godliness. Do you believe that? Because the presence of sin comes from this discontentment with the world and the belief that God does not have your best interests at heart. A heart that's set on Him, a heart that trusts on Him, does not care that happens in this world. Because their heart is set firmly on His Word. Where He leads, I follow. Walking with Thee from day to day. All of these songs that we sing typify this amount of faith that we need to have that is a complete measure of trust within Him. Look back, if you would, at Genesis chapter 22. We talked about this a little bit on Wednesday. I want to highlight this again tonight because I think it's an important story. Genesis chapter 22 is a story that is familiar to probably just about every one of us. Maybe if you're not familiar with the passage, you're more than likely familiar with the story. In Genesis chapter 22, starting in verse 1. Interesting incident in the life of Abraham. Genesis 22, starting in verse 1. Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, he said, here I am. And he said, take now your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah. Offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I tell you. Abraham arose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son. He split wood for the burnt offering, and he arose and went to the place in which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. And Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey, and listen to this. I and the lad will go over there, and we will worship and return to you. What you need to see within these first several verses of Genesis chapter 22 is this uncompromising faith that God has. Hebrews 11 will expound more on this idea by saying that Abraham absolutely believed that God would raise back Isaac, whether in the moment or years from now, whatever the situation is, that he believed that God would raise Isaac back up. And so when he says to these young men who are following him, we're going to go over there and then we're going to go return, that's not a wasted word. Abraham diligently believes that. Abraham then, verse 6, takes the wood of the burnt offering, lays it on Isaac his son, takes in his hand the fire and the knife. The 2 of them walked then on together. Isaac, verse 7, spoke to Abraham his father and said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. And he said, behold, the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, God will provide. That's a fantastic 3-word section if you underline or highlight in your Bible. God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So the 2 of them walked on together. Then they came to the place at which God had told him, and Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood, bound his son Isaac and laid him up on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. Verse 11, but the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. Verse 12, he said, don't stretch out your hand against the lad, do nothing to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Let me tell you who's the star of this story. The star of Genesis chapter 22 always is, for everybody's mindset, Abraham. Because Abraham is this person who took Isaac, his son, and walked him up to Mount Moriah, eventually where the temple would be built, and he places him on the altar, and he raises his knife in faith, believing that God would raise up Isaac. Faith, 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 everywhere with Abraham. Let me tell you who's also the star of this story. Isaac. Because when Abraham and Isaac walk out towards Mount Moriah, and they're heading towards the place of sacrifice, Isaac doesn't see a lamb anywhere. He doesn't know where the sacrifice is coming. And then once they leave the people that are there with them, and they march this 3-day walk from there all the way to Mount Moriah, Isaac asks his father, where is the sacrifice? And he says, don't worry, God's going to provide for us. They continue walking. And then they get to the top of Mount Moriah, and Abraham picks up Isaac and binds him and places him on the altar. And guess what Isaac does? He lays there. And then Abraham raises the knife above his head, about to slay his son. And guess what Isaac does? He lays there. Isaac should be just as renowned in this story for his faith as Abraham was for his. And that's the type of faith that we need to have, that even though all these things are happening around us, and even though metaphorically it feels like the knife is right above us, we know that God provides for us. Even if it costs us our physical life. Even if it means that we won't leave this life, which nobody leaves this life alive, that was a silly comment, but even if it means that we will undergo persecutions, we know that God is with us. I know that God is with me. And I know whom I believe in. I can exclaim that He is with me every single step of the way. A childlike faith is a faith that looks towards God with untold amounts of confidence, not just in what I can see, and the things that I can't see. When Jesus sent the 70 out, as heralds for his ministry. He sent them out first and foremost without any food, without any money, and they went out and they had resounding success. And when they came back, he asked them, "Did you need anything?" And that wasn't for Jesus' benefits. And they said, "No, we didn't lack anything." The reason he asked them that question was to cement in their mind that he would take care of them as long as they did his will. And ladies and gentlemen, a childlike faith is a faith that does God's will, but believes that he will provide for you. Remember what the definition of faith is, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6. Not only believes that God is, but that he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Do we have that pure, undefiled confidence in God? And if not, why not? It's a faith based on wonder. When was the last time you sat down, and this is not a specific question for Howard, although I guess it could be, but when was the last time you sat down and you just honestly marveled at God? When was the last time you sat there and you observed the beauty of God's creation and just marveled at his power? When I was in Africa, there was a place, after 6 weeks, we went to a place called Victoria Falls. And if you've seen Victoria Falls in pictures, it's like the cliche always goes, it's nothing like in pictures what it is like in person, because it dumps, I think, 1.5 to 2 times the amount of water of Niagara Falls, and it stretches it out over like a mile and a half span. And there's all these different viewpoints that you can see, but when you stand at that Victoria Falls, you stand at any waterfall or any kind of overwhelming sense of God's power, you cannot help but just be enveloped by it. And I found myself standing there, mostly because I didn't really have anywhere else to go at that moment, but I found myself standing there watching the water pour over for hours. And I went other places, I got lunch, and I came back, and I stood there and watched, and just marveled. But it's almost impossible to stand there in front of something like that and not be completely taken aback by God's overwhelming power. Sometimes we become so obsessed with our life and the things that I've accomplished. I always think of that movie with Tom Hanks where he builds a fire on the beach and then he says, "Look at what I've created," as if that's something amazing. But we stand there and we look at our career, we look at our house, we look at our possession, look at everything that we have, and we marvel at what we have done. When in reality, the wonder does not lie with us, it lies with God. Because you can look out your front door and see the leaves that change with the seasons. You can look at the fact that it's December and it's still 137,000 degrees outside and marvel at the fact that it's not changing for whatever reason. But it's impossible to look at nature and not be in awe of what God has created for us. I don't agree with everything Martin Luther had to say, but I think it's very fitting. Martin Luther once said, if it took God 7 days to create the world, imagine what he's done with 5,000 years in creating heaven. I think that's an interesting point. We need to look at the creation of the world around us as being truly, as God said, truly good. In Acts 14, as Paul is talking to various people about the gospel, he mentions a couple of things that these people had completely fallen off the radar on. In Acts chapter 14, this comes on the heels of, ironically, a man healing the feet of a lame man in Lystra. And in Acts chapter 14, it says in verse 12, as soon as this miracle happens, it says they began calling Barnabas Zeus and Paul Hermes because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowds. Imagine if you can real quick, Paul and Silas, or Paul and Barnabas rather, that are standing here in front of an entire town of people that want to give him the keys of the city, that want to throw a parade in his behalf, and that want to call him deity. In verse 14, the response from the apostles. Barnabas and Paul heard of it. They tore their robes and rushed into the crowd, saying, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of the same nature as you. Preach the gospel to you that you should turn from these vain things to a living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. And the generations," verse 16, "gone by, he permitted all the nations to go their own ways." Well, listen to this. "And yet he did not leave himself without witness. And that he did good and gave you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness." Even saying these things with difficulty, they restrained the crowds from offering sacrifice to them. You want to know why atheists are called fools? You want to know why sinners and people in the book of Proverbs and Psalms are called fools? It's because they look at the evidence that is plainly in front of them and they deny its very existence. It takes a lot of, whatever you want to call it, moxie, guts, foolishness, whatever you want to call it, to look at creation, to look at the world around us, and say that it just happened. And I'm sorry if that offends anybody here. I don't think it does. But you walk out that door and you look at the grass and you look at the trees, you look at the cows, that's the theme of this morning apparently. You look at all the things around us, and it's hard not to imagine, not to believe that this world came with a purpose. And it came from somebody who created it purposefully. And in Acts chapter 14 talks about when Paul and Silas are speaking to the crowds, he says he didn't leave himself without witness. He didn't leave himself without any way to see that there is a creator. All you have to do is look at creation. And you know that there's something out there. Romans chapter 1, as Paul dives more into this concept. Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1, starting at verse 18. Paul writes, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness." That lays the groundwork for the passage that's immediately about to follow. "Because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them, by nature, by the world, by everything that we see in our life. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse." Nobody that denies God's existence is without excuse. "So they became, though they did not know God, for even though they knew God," sorry, verse 21, "they did not honor Him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, and of birds, and of four-footed animals, and crawling creatures. Therefore God gave them over in the lust of their hearts to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them, for they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen." What gall mankind has that we can look at the world around us and yet still deny that there's a Creator. And what gall we as Christians have that we can take one step outside and not be overpowered by a sense of God's majesty. One of the most heart-wrenching stories of at least the last year, 2017, and there's a lot of very personal heart-wrenching stories, many of which are in this congregation right now. But 2017, one of the most heart-wrenching stories that I at least saw in the news was the story of a woman named Brittany Maynard. And I don't know if that name rings familiar to anybody. Brittany Maynard, I guess it was the end of 2016, was an advocate in the news for this right to life, or right to death kind of program that she was trying to initiate. And she was lobbying for the ability for you to have physician-assisted suicide because she had been diagnosed with some kind of stage 4 brain tumor that was going to just ravage her body. And I looked at that and I felt sympathy for that. And there were responses that came from all over the place saying, "Don't give up, don't fight for this, fight for life, fight for a cure." She wanted to end her life legally. But right before she did that, what Brittany Maynard decided to do was that she was going to go throughout the entire country and she was going to fulfill these bucket list items. She was going to go to Alaska. She was going to see all the different mountains and the snow, tundra. Then she was going to go to Yellowstone. She was going to see Old Faithful. She was going to see all the marvels of Yellowstone. She was going to go to the Grand Canyon. That was going to be the last place that she went to, I think, 3 weeks before she eventually died. And she was going to see the Grand Canyon. That was the precipice. And as I followed her story, because it was interesting to me about somebody who's approaching finality of life, who's around my age, and does so very publicly. At no point in any of her travels, as she saw Yellowstone, as she saw Alaska, as she saw the Grand Canyon, did she ever say anything remotely resembling the phrase, "Look at what our God has created." And I don't know about what my life would be like at that moment. But I would like to think that if I was in her shoes and I knew the end was coming, I saw these different marvels of humanity or marvels of creation, I'd be overpowered with what our God had created. Overpowered with the fleetingness of life. And overpowered with what God has done for us. All these things should enrapture us, and we should be left sitting there every single time with a strong sense of wonder about the world around us. When was the last time that you truly marveled in the world around you? When was the last time you looked at the sky and said, "Look at what God has painted for me this morning"? When was the last time you saw something beautiful and truly thought, "This is the most amazing thing that I've ever seen in my entire life"? You see the cynicism in John the 12th chapter. John chapter 12, as Jesus is discussing different things with his apostles, and the Pharisees and the Sadducees show up, as they so oftentimes did, ruined everything. John chapter 12, starting in verse 37. It says, "But though he had performed so many signs, he being Jesus, before them, yet they weren't believing in him. And yet this was to fulfill the word of Isaiah the prophet, which he spoke, 'Lord, who has believed our report? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed?' For this reason they could not believe, for Isaiah said again, He has blinded their eyes and He hardened their heart, so they would not see with their eyes and perceive with their heart, and be converted, and I would heal them. These things Isaiah said because he saw His glory, and he spoke of them. And nevertheless, many even of the rulers believed in Him, but because of the Pharisees they were not confessing Him, for fear that they would be put out of the synagogue. And the most tragic verse of all, verse 43, for they loved the approval of men rather than the approval of God. Those men that they sought so eagerly to have their approval are long gone. And yet God remains. And what a sad state of affairs that you can see something as amazing as Jesus walking on this earth, doing the miracles that He did, by performing the signs, all the different things, and not come away with it. But they believe in His deity. Not because you don't want it, like you can't believe, because you simply refuse to. And while we demonize the Pharisees and the Sadducees for their lack of belief in these things, we do the exact same thing sometimes when we step out our front door and we never, ever, at any point in time, marvel and see the things that God has created. Every single day it should fill us with wonder. Every single day it should fill us with majesty and with love and with appreciation for what He's done. One of my favorite historical figures, besides being Teddy Roosevelt, who I know Casey hates, one of my favorite historical figures is Albert Einstein. Not because I believe that I'm Einstein, far away from it. As a matter of fact, if you look at my physics grades, they were very un-Einstein-like. But Albert Einstein, to me, was one of the most interesting figures, not just because he was a super genius, and there's been studies to show how his brain worked, and it was beyond amazing, but because of his capacity and his understanding for the world around him. He wasn't just content to see the world as it was and understand the minutiae. He wanted to know why. It makes him, for all intents and purposes, one of the very last public kind of scientist philosophers, if I can use that. Einstein, for instance, developed the Avogadro's number, which determines the size of molecules. Solved the photoelectric effect, helped establish the field of quantum mechanics, worked on the Manhattan Project, which is where the atom bomb showed up. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1921. Albert Einstein, towards the end of his life, wrote a series of letters to his friends that, if you ever take the time to read them, I think you would do wonders, because they're so inspiring, not from a religious standpoint, but just from a depth of knowledge and appreciation standpoint. And as he wrote towards his friend towards the end of his life, he told his friend, people like you and me never grow old. Pay attention to that. People like you and me never grow old, because we never cease to stand like curious children before the great mystery into which we are born. Far be it from any of us that we should ever at any point lose our appreciation for the world around us, but more importantly, lose our appreciation for the Creator who created all of it. A childlike faith is one that wonders at the majesty and marvels at God's God's creation, because He Himself is not a created being. It's a faith that looks to God with untold amounts of trust and confidence that His will is the one that we should follow above anything else, with a love and with a passion for who He is. That's the God that I serve. And I pray that that's the God that you serve. And this morning, as so many people reflected for the first time probably all year in the life of Christ and what He's done, I leave you with a simple statement. Do you have a childlike faith in Him? Do you have trust in Him? Do you have a sense of innocence, not from naivety, but for a sense of purity about the world around you? Do you marvel at God daily? Do I have a childlike faith in God that's necessary to enter your kingdom? And if not, why not? Don't allow yourself to become so cynical by age or by experience or by whatever the situation is that we fail to appreciate God in all His majesty. And if we can help restore that faith in you, if we can help guide you, if we can pray with you, if we can do anything with you to help with that, I beg you, the people here, loving